Yeah.
Brilliant.
Good. So over to you, Owen. Thanks for coming. So we've got an audience with Owen. We are privileged above all men. There you go.
Yeah. Thanks for the invite, Tony. So whilst I think I'm talking here to like on the face of it on the Zoom call, I think to people who have definitely got experience around what I'm going to talk about, I'm also going to address it as though there are people who aren't here like that, because I'm sure some might want to watch it. So yeah, so my name's Owen Hylton. I'm the pastor of Beacon Church in Brixton. I was formerly an elder at King's Church in London. And whilst there, I wrote a book around the issues of diversity in the church. This is back 12, 13 years ago. And, you know, whether I've wanted to or not, I've had to keep going with that kind of subject in my kind of Christian experience. And I think, you know, we were just saying before we've kind of started, the murder of George Floyd seems to be a bit of a watershed moment in terms of how the church particularly responds to this issue. And I'm talking about the church. I'm not so much talking about what's going on beyond the church, even though we're not an island and we can't completely shut out the world. My focus is around the church. And there are many issues that have arisen, and some deep issues that I say I'm not going to address now, but around history and theology for me, and pastoral response, and reconciliation at a kind of a deeper level. However, what I am going to talk about today, and I'm going to talk for a bit and then we'll have a conversation, is the biggest practical issue that I get asked about and that I can see, and that's around leadership in local church contexts. And there is an issue of leadership in other contexts, whether they be charities or whatever. But for us, the biggest practical issue I get asked about is leadership. How do we raise more leaders? Because it's at that level that we are recognizing we lack. Even sometimes when we have people in position, we lack what we think the breadth that should bring to us, that it doesn't always seem to bring it to us. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I have done in different contexts. So I hope it's helpful. I mean, the first thing, probably just a short personal testimony around that. I was raised in a Baptist New Frontiers kind of church since I was like 11 years old, in fact younger. And so when I came into leadership in a context which there were very, very few people like me. And whilst nobody ever made any comment about me in relation to my race, there was clearly a different way of responding to me, and there was a different way that I had to respond to people. I mean, I discovered early on, though, that I had a calling to lead, and therefore I wasn't kind of concerned by it. I could step into positions of leadership quite easily, even if I did get a bit of a reaction, and at times I did. I remember leading the first area of ministry I had in the church I was in, and I had other people who were laughing at me in kind of in the front row, and most of the people I led, probably 90% of the people I led, were not like me. And so I was having to just prove myself as a leader in different contexts. I've done training around leadership, literally around the country in different contexts, and I think part of the reason that it's more tricky sometimes to bring people through who are different is we're just not used to it. We're not used to being led by people who don't look like us, and we're certainly not used to being led by people from who are from a different race and not from the majority race. We're just not used to it, and I've seen that in different contexts where I've done a bit of training and that kind of stuff. But it is probably the single biggest issue that I'm being asked about at the moment. I just want to reference 4 passages of scripture that, just to really point to them, I'm not going to go into them. The first is the story in Acts 6, verses 1 to 7, where we find the I suppose the beginning of a diversity in leadership, when you have Greek named leaders being I suppose appointed into positions of leadership. And the thing to note about it is the non-cultural nature of those appointments, and the character that was required to be appointed into leadership. And I think that's something that we could do well to look into again. What does the Bible say about what a leader looks like, rather than what we might say? So Acts chapter 6 would be one. 1 Timothy 3 verses 1 to 13, where you have the characteristics of elders and deacons. And again in Titus 1, 5 to 9, you again look at those characteristics. It feels to me at times that we've added to those characteristics all sorts of other things that help us. But when you look at those characteristics, actually they're non-cultural, they're non-racial. They don't relate to people of a particular race or background. They can relate to any believer. And then probably the passage in Isaiah 11, verses 6 to 9, which really talks about these kind of unusual relationships, the wolf lying down with the lamb and all of those kinds of things. And when I've thought about that, and Harvey Kwiani quotes this in his book, this idea of making room for things that are different, and for the lamb to lie down with the wolf, it's the wolf that has to change. It's not the lamb. The lamb doesn't suddenly become fearless or grow teeth. It's the wolf that has to rein in its carnal nature in order that kind of relationship can work. And so for me, that speaks of, for us to grow diversity in leadership, it's the church that has to change. It's the main body. It's us that need to make the changes, and sometimes rein in some of our ways of thinking in order that we can make room for other people. And so that would be quite a fundamental thing for me.
Can I just interrupt there? Just because Lind has challenged me and that interpretation, which I thought, if I just throw it in, because I think it's quite helpful. She says, actually, that's looking at from the wrong perspective, or not the full perspective. She says that the lamb also needs to change, because she says that the lamb would be in fear of the wolf.
Yes.
And so that there's an action that's required on both of them, and the lamb also needs to overcome their fear of the wolf. And I hadn't seen that. And I thought that shows another sign of my inability to sit and see that. So I just throw that in because I thought.
No, that's helpful. And I think probably there is an underlying thing in the way I've presented it, which is we don't think the wolf needs to change. We actually think that when people come in, they need to change in order to become like us. And we don't think that we need to change in order to embrace them. So, but I totally get your point that the lamb needs to become, lose its fear of the wolf in order for that to work. So thank you, Tony. So just those verses, for me, it's re-looking at them, because those verses do talk about leadership, and they talk about the characteristics of leaders. And when you look at them in the scripture, they're not cultural. They're not race related, and therefore they must be able to identify leaders from across different backgrounds. And so we should be looking back at them, and also maybe asking ourselves the question, what do I add to those things that mean the way I bring leaders through, it only seems to bring people like me through? What is it that I'm adding, myself to it? Anyway, and so now, obviously, we've lived through the kind of the pandemic season and the Zoom church season, and what I've found, one of the things that I found interesting about that is on Zoom, at least anyway, how diverse churches can look, in terms of who hosts and who leads worship and all that. Churches can look very diverse, and yet sometimes behind that it's not reflective of what the church is actually like. It might be reflective, in a good way, of what the church wants to be, but it's not actually reflective of what the church is like. And sometimes the diversity that we see presented to us is, I suppose we don't mean it to be tokenistic, but it is tokenistic. And by that I mean we present diversity with people who maybe we don't have strong relationship with, maybe they have no influence or authority, but they're the right people to look up front. And we do that. And I think sometimes we have to be a little bit honest with ourselves about that. And because that is so common, you go to almost any church website, you would have said, oh, these churches are really diverse. The reality of that, it can be very, very different in terms of where influence and decision and relationships really are. And we have to be honest about that ourselves when we're trying to bring people through into leadership. And so my personal thing is that churches are courageous in being what they are up front and publicly, with an intention of trying to build something behind that brings about real change. And I'm going to talk about just a few things that we can do. I mean, there's an interesting article on the I think it's on the BBC app, the BBC app, and it's about this black woman who's a scientist who got called into this another scientist group in order that she could be part of their photo of their team, because it helped with funding and all that kind of stuff. Now, that's a really obvious one, and it's there on the website, the BBC website, but behind that there is a thing of how we can sometimes feel a pressure to look right, even if things aren't right. And my thing is, let's be courageous. It's a balance in that, but let's be courageous in being what we are, but also in a commitment and intention to change things. And lots of churches are, and I've seen that in lots of different ways, which is encouraging. So I just want to give some thoughts around how you do that. How do you bring leaders through who look different to you? How do you do that with a level of integrity in your approach? And how do you do that in a way that it's not all about one special person that you've got in your church, and you see the one person, you think, I could get them through, that will make all the difference. How do you do that? So I'll just throw out some thoughts, and then we can just get into a conversation around it. So the first thing that I've realized that you can do, or try and do, is to create multiple pathways for multiple leaders. So you don't build it around one individual, the great person who might come through to lead worship or be an elder. You try and create multiple pathways for multiple leaders. And what that means you need to do is probably broaden the way you bring leaders through right now. So however you do it, where we often it's in relationship, and there might be certain kinds of characteristics that we look for in leaders, people who are passionate, who are loyal, are always there, who come to the prayer meeting, and all of those kinds of things. And actually, sometimes we need to broaden, because in many of our kinds of churches, activists are the people that we see. And they're like, wow, yeah, this person's really going somewhere. And yet leadership can manifest in so many different ways. And it's not just activism that does it. So creating multiple pathways for multiple leaders to come through, that might be whether it's small group leaders, support leaders, people who do communion for you on a Sunday, yes, people who host meetings, lead worship, assisting groups, run welcome teams, all of those things, just creating more and more opportunities. At the same time, I would suggest, although this might sound a bit counterintuitive, create slightly more formal structures, because our informal structures are based around relationships. We draw people into leadership who we have relationship with, and in reality we can't have relationship with everyone, so it becomes harder to draw in breadth of people And we can get tired of it and, oh, okay, I've got to build this relationship and that relationship. Sometimes slightly more formal structures helps this. And I don't know whether this is why they do it, but King's in London, they have something like this. So they run a pastoral apprenticeship, which it's a slightly more formal way of bringing leaders through in their church. And you can do a 2-year apprenticeship as a pastor at the church, and it has definitely increased their diversity. And so maybe in some churches, you can think about how do we increase that kind of thing. The other thing is to recognize and be honest with yourself, your cultural bias in your current ways of bringing people through. As I said, that it's activism, but also we have a thing about servant leadership. But for us, what servant leadership means is people put out chairs, people are willing to do stuff, they're willing to do the menial tasks, and that's where we all begin, and then we kind of move on. Whereas servant leadership, that doesn't necessarily need to look like that. It can look very different in the way someone serves their family. So we just need to broaden how we understand leadership and the ways in which leaders might come through. For me personally, one of the things that I've done is I've often run discipleship groups. And I suppose I got that model because when I was in my previous church, the leader ran a discipleship group, and there were 7 of us there. I don't even think it lasted a long time, but it clearly had quite an impact on me. And out of that discipleship group, 2 elders came for that particular church. The thing about discipleship groups is it can do 2 things, and I've run them. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call them around eldership. I have in the past, but I don't think I would now. I would just call them discipleship groups. But what they do is they do 2 things. First of all, they do help build relationship with numbers of people. And the second thing that they do is they help you shape and understand people's theologies and their philosophies, and you get to know them. And so the 2 things that you're really looking for, you begin to get to know through running the discipleship group. I ran one for 2 years. I ran another one, out of which I got 2 other elders, because I had relationship that built trust. That meant that when we needed elders, because we didn't run it to get them, but they came out of it, they were there, and I built relationship. And so I feel like, in my context, it's a small one, but I almost feel in a bigger church, leaders who do that will go a long way to being able to build something that is genuinely diverse with people that they know and trust and stuff. So discipleship groups really help. And you can, and obviously if you get enough people in it, you can broaden the numbers. You don't need to know everyone who joins, because you're not asking everyone to become a leader at the end. You're just, in part, you're building relationships with people, and you're discipling people, which is part of what we're called to do, but quite specifically. And then the other thing that, again, I think is a good thing to do, and I know that I've done it, is when you bring people through into leadership positions, you can put timescales around those things, which just helps. Timescales, doing stuff for trial periods, with putting in reviews. First of all, it means that you're going to get less questions back if other people are not sure, because they'll see, okay, there's a kind of a timescale, and it also becomes a good measuring point for giving people space to lead, and that's what you really want to create space for people to be able to lead. People up front is important because people like to see themselves, but you want to avoid that as a tokenistic gesture. You want people up front to be people who, if they step down from the platform, they would have influence and a role within things, rather than, oh, okay, that person's on a rota where they host, and no, you only never see them 10 minutes before the meeting. That there's more to it than that. So I do think the more leaders you can bring through, the more, and the more you can bring them through without it being tokenistic and genuinely making room, the church will change. Yeah, the church will change simply because of the numbers of people that you can bring through, and the fact that what they bring is valuable in and of itself. It's not that they've started to lead like you, you've accepted them in a different kind of way. So yeah, that's probably all I want to talk about, but I'd like to throw it open and us, just have a conversation around it. You can ask any questions, and yeah. So over to you, Tony and Gavin.
It's really helpful. I mean, absolutely helpful. And it's funny just how simple it is, but I think sometimes one can get caught up in the kind of busyness of church, which is a horrible thing to sort of say. And those things can quite easily get left by the wayside because you lean on the people that you know, and you lean on the people that are there already, and you then, there's a blind spot, isn't there? Because then you're not giving yourself time to look at that broadening process. I just wonder if you could just unpack a little bit what that discipleship kind of program looks and feels like, because it's a really nice balance, isn't it, between formalizing the structure but still giving yourself time to get to know people, because I think that's at the heart of helping get people into leadership, isn't it? It's building that trust. And I wonder if you can just tell us a bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, so I've done it in different ways, and I've been in it in different ways. But what it has essentially looked like for the way I've done it is, I remember emailing a group of guys. I think I emailed about 12 guys in the church, and I said, I actually said, I'm going to disciple you or something like that. So I wasn't even like, pretending we were all going to be bent. I said, no, we're going to do a discipleship group, which I'm going to lead. And what we did really is we went through books of the Bible. So we began in Colossians, and I think we went to Timothy. I can't remember what the books were, but over a 2-year period, we went through books of the Bible. And each week we gathered every other week at 6:30 for an hour. These were in the days when we could do it in my house. And then the last 6 months of it was online because of the pandemic. But they would be coming to my house, most of them. And it probably whittled down to maybe there were 5 or 6 guys who were regular, who were regular. And we would just look at a passage in the scripture. So, Colossians 1, the first half of it we would look at one week, and then the second half of it would look at the following week. And it would literally be, we're just unpacking it together. We're just unpacking it together. And then at the end, I would just bring some summary thoughts, and I suppose how I understood certain things and stuff. So it wasn't overly formal or structured. I didn't have to do lots of prep because I could never have done that. So in that sense, it was aimed at people who might be leadership types, or people that you might want to build into leadership in the future in the church. It probably wasn't just aimed at anyone. But what it meant was that the benefits were that I got to know some people. The benefits were we unpacked theology together. The benefits were that they got to know one another. And the benefits were then you could you could then release people. So you might not even release them immediately, but in time when you did, you knew you trusted them. And I think that you can do that with groups of guys, but you can also do that in mixed groups. So it doesn't have to be a group of guys. It can be mixed groups. And when you've done that, it means that when people stand up, you might not know everything they're going to say, but you have enough relationship and enough trust that you're happy. You're happy with what they might say, and you can weather the things that they might not say, and you're not overly focused on the fact that, oh, this person's going to talk about this and I'm not sure that I agree with it. I don't worry about that so much, because in any film you watch that's a 15, there might be bits in it you think, oh, I'm not very comfortable with that, but you don't throw the film out because there are bits in it you don't feel comfortable with. So that is kind of how I've done it in the past. I did a lunchtime one disciple Bible study as well. So that's kind of how I've more recently done it. In the past, I've had people that come into it as well, like guests, I suppose. But yeah, it's really just about gathering people and getting to know them, but using the Bible and that context to do it.
And is this, I mean, that's really helpful, Owen. Is this a group of people that you would have like initially gotten to know slightly so that you feel comfortable approaching them? Or is this a group that you've not necessarily picked at random, but been a bit more kind of free in how you've just said, look, I'm just going to grab these 12 people and see where it goes? Or has there been an initial kind of filtering on your part to kind of ensure you've been intentional about broadening that kind of demographics of that group?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I invited 12 and there wasn't no magic in that. Yeah, so I wasn't trying to be magical at that inviting 12. I think that was just the number of people that there were. I invited 12 and I think 9 came, and then it settled to a certain number. I think if you invite that kind of number, you can take 1 or 2 risks. So, and I would do, because there will be people that you don't know that you think, I've just got a feeling about them. I don't know them really. But you know, he's turned up here with his wife, his kids, he's been a Christian for, I've got a feeling. I would invite them in, because I'm not, the meeting is not necessarily with a specific view. I did do one called Elders Plus, and for me that was a mistake, because I just had to keep working on, it's not what you think it is. This is not like a group of people who are necessarily going to become elders. We're not looking at it like that. So I just removed all of those kind of loaded connotations and called it a discipleship group that I led. And it put me in touch with 8 or 9 people regularly in the church. And, you know, 1 or 2 of them you could take on who you don't really know, because you know that group will be able to carry it. So, yeah.
Just a comment and a question. So the comment is, I just think it's really helpful, because I think that in some contexts the power of talking about George Floyd is waning, and that I was looking at some stuff which referred to George Floyd, and it just seems so long ago. And I think that we're beyond sort of the knee-jerk reaction to it, and need to do things which are much deeper, and it's underlying issues, and almost trying to keep referring back to George Floyd can be a bit counterproductive. And it's not the rhetoric anymore, is it the actions? And what you're describing is, I think, key in terms of the actions. The other comment is that, and we've talked about it a bit before privately and the like, but I think what those looking at the ethnic changes also find themselves looking at issues about gender and also social class, which is what Paul talked about, that there's the 3 going together. And I think that what is proposed applies to all 3 areas of bringing in the outcasts, whether they're ethnic outcasts, social outcasts, or gender outcasts. So those are just some comments that why I feel what you're saying is helpful. In that, one of the things that, in terms of bringing people through, that I struggle with, and I think some of it is cultural, some of it is in terms of marriages, so that and I don't think it's just cultural, but it may be a cultural element there, that some people work very closely together as husband and wife, and some people work almost independently, and you're not always fully aware of that. And so in terms of bringing people through, sometimes you want, I'm just thinking of people, there's some couples that you intuitively think you ought to bring through, and some individuals that you think either because they're not married or they're married. But I always find it hard to really be confident in that, and just wonder whether you've got any sort of wisdom or comments on that from a cultural standpoint, but also from a generalized standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think the general thing would be us being very clear what makes Christian marriage work, not necessarily what makes marriages that look like mine work. And so I do think, you know, and so for me, because that's a really good point, because it's a big thing for me. Yeah. So I can, my danger is I'm more likely to ignore gift, and I'm looking at home, I'm looking there. And so I think the characteristics that we read about, I think we need to move back to them when we look at characteristics in Timothy and in Titus, even in Genesis. You know, the whole thing of leaving and cleaving, for me, I don't want to overplay it, but it's massive what that looks like. What does that mean? And Ephesians 5, yes, the Bible says wives submit to your husbands, and it says husbands love your wives like Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. So this idea of sacrifice and submission, and at least having some understanding of what that looks like. So you're exactly right. I sometimes have brought couples through together very intentionally, where you see that. It's always tricky when you bring couples through together because you don't know all the ramifications. But where you see that, I have brought couples through together. We've had a couple that led our worship team together for years. You know, now I'll be really honest. At the very beginning, I think in my mind I was thinking about him, but when I did it, the invitation went to both, and I'm so glad I did that. I'm so glad I did that, because they just worked so well together, and they brought different views and different perspectives. So definitely, I'm looking for that. Now, they were a couple that had grown up, that when they came to the church they were dating, so we did their marriage prep and all of that kind of stuff. But where new couples come, I'd be pushing in a little bit, and definitely I bring people through together where I can. Or if I'm bringing through one, I just need to be relatively comfortable that behind that is a healthy, functioning Christian marriage. And sometimes, and I'm sure, Tony, you would have done this, and I've tried to do this, I'll do equipping sessions around marriage and ministry, just trying to help people. And if you do it to numbers of people, you're not picking out an individual couple and saying, oh, you need to do it like this, but just bringing out principles of how do you know, because, you know, I worked full-time in secular employment. I had 3 kids and I was involved in the church. How do you manage all of that? You know, and so, and particularly in today's world, where often men and women are leaders in their, you know, in the way they function. So how do you do that? So definitely the marriage thing is a major part of it. Now I'm trying not to make cultural judgments on people, but some of the cultural things that you might see is, you know, you might see one person who's right forward and the other person, they don't even come to the church. Yeah. So you might have a scenario where a couple are going to different churches. And I understand that happens culturally. I would be more cautious with it, just because I would need to find out. I would need to become to some kind of sense of I'm comfortable with how that has emerged for you guys, and that's not a permanent state of play. Because sometimes in transition people might move quicker than others. I get that, but it's not probably the model. It's not the model, because you want to create models that make sense for families and the church. Because I am prepared, difficult as it is, for my life and family to be an example, to be a model, and therefore if Pauline's never anywhere, and if then it doesn't work like that. So it's definitely a part of what I would talk about, marriage and ministry and stuff.
That's how, but it's easy, difficult. It's more difficult than it sounds in my experience, in terms of the stuff that has been peddled in the past in terms of marriage and family is very cultural.
Yeah.
So it's one of the areas, looking back, that we have perpetuated a cultural form of things rather than a biblical form, and even sort of deep-seated there can be that expectation. So yeah, and not just marriage but also family life.
Yes.
And so what, yeah, I've got numerous examples of that, but it's much harder, therefore, isn't it, to actually do proper biblical teaching on and have proper biblical expectations in terms of marriage and family life, because we're so entrenched in our cultural experience.
It is, but the way, one of the ways to do that, and this can be dissatisfying for some but helpful for others. When I preach on marriage, for example, or family, I preach principle and I rarely go practical, because the moment I go practical, I go cultural.
Right, yeah.
The moment I say 7 o'clock, you put your kids to bed, that's a cultural understanding of application of it. It's a bit like servant leadership means I put out chairs. In some contexts it does, in other contexts it doesn't. And so I'm not, so you have to work it out, but you can't automatically use practical solutions to things, because they are definitely cultural, and therefore either people are trying to assimilate to become like you, and they're trying to put their kids to bed at 7 when they never ever did that before, or that they're never going to become leaders because you think leaders do it this way. And so the journey isn't a straightforward one, but it's a journey you can be committed to. And also you will find, I'm sure in all of our kinds of churches, you will find people that bridge that for you, and so therefore they help you do it. So it's not about you having to understand everything, but God will have provided people who can bridge it for you. And then behind that might come other people who do it very differently, but it doesn't take long. After a while, you can go, oh, I can accept that as a way. I can accept that that people can come through like that. So that would be my principle, not practical. I've been probably doing that for 15 years.
And do you explicitly say that actually I'm talking about this principle, actually there's no one right practical way about working it, and not because the danger is for us white middle class people, and the whole thing about white superiority, we think our way is the way. And so do you sort of say, because I'm just aware that I have people who think that their practical way is the biblical.
I know. So you do have to say, and so people around me would know that. You do have to say, I mean, you're not the only group, why it's not the only group who would think their way is the right way. But that's fine. But I think if you're going to build a church that is genuinely multicultural and genuinely allows people from different backgrounds to flourish, you have to find a new way and a different culture, and you have to you have to become aware of some things that you might never have thought about before. For example, unconscious bias towards people like yourselves, which is really covered very clearly in James 2 when it talks about favoritism. So James 2 becomes a fundamental biblical outworking of what we know as unconscious bias, where we look at people and really we look at people that look like us, and to realize that, oh no, that is not so you might have to retrain your mind and you begin the retraining of the culture of your church so that you're not doing that. And the more people that you bring through into leadership, particularly into senior aspects of leadership, the decision-making, influential, culture-shaping aspect of leadership, the easier that becomes. Easier, it's never easy, but it just becomes easier.
One thing that we're tentatively experimenting with, but no way going the full hog as I think we could, is our sort of small groups. Is what one of looking to be sort of more of a family group on a Saturday, just recognizing that our pattern of life groups or small groups happening in an evening with just adults doesn't culturally fit. And sort of the thing that made me aware of that is realizing that Asian churches, they have all their small groups on Saturdays because the Asian culture is very much family orientated, and they would never come to a sort of an evening meeting without the kids because they want to involve the kids in everything. And so we're tentatively looking to do something like that, recognizing that even our structure of the church can dictate a certain form of family life.
Yeah, and I just think it's just being open to those kinds of changes, and you might not, you might not probably want to, swing from we did it like this, now we're going to do it all like that. But it's just recognizing, because probably somewhere in the middle there you would have African churches that are much more that their kids will be with them. Their kids won't be in a nested. A lot of black churches don't necessarily even do kids work.
Yeah.
So it's recognizing those differences and not seeing those differences as negative, which is how we naturally do it, but rather just seeing them as different, and that our church can embrace all of these ways of doing. I mean, I know, so we run church services on Zoom, and we kind of replicate what we do on a Sunday onto Zoom. We host meetings, we do notices, and all that kind of stuff. And I know families, particularly African families, where they just now do their own service at home.
Right.
So they're not engaging on, your Zoom thing. They're running their own. Father's gathering the family and doing his thing with the family. And I'm not talking about to kids of 6 or 7. I'm talking about to teenagers and kids in their teenagers and young adults going to family worship. And so. And there's a huge strength in that. You do that well. There's a huge strength in doing things like that. So it's recognizing that these things are different, and it's just becoming broader in how we think about it.
It is, but it's the challenge, isn't it, of allowing different ways of doing things to be acceptable, but on some levels you can't do it. You've got to make a decision. So I'm just aware through my friendship with Black majority leaders, their understanding of youth goes up to 30, and so that they have a much wider understanding of that. And whereas for us, sort of in more white churches, our youth finishes at 18. But you can't do both on the same.
Well, yeah, but the thing you could argue in our context, the observation of our context, is you might say youth finishes at 18, but how many churches now run student 20s, young adults? So we're kind of saying the same thing. We're just using different terminology. We're recognizing that there is a need for 12 to 30-year-olds to have something. It might not all be together, but loads of churches are thinking we've got to think about this group. We can't just ignore that group.
Okay. And I suppose the decision then is how you segregate, how much you have them all together, how much you have them apart, and so forth. Yeah. And maybe that's why, I guess I'm mumbling, aren't I? I guess we're learning we need to do that if we want to keep them, but many of us, it is that the 20-year-olds that we're missing because we haven't done anything properly with them.
Yeah, you want to keep them, but it's more than you want to keep them. What I've said to we don't have many, we're a small church, we don't have many, but we got a few in that age group. And what I've been saying to them since they were teenagers, because this was my experience, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, is look and learn.
Yeah.
Look at the families you see here. Look at how the men function with their kids. Look at how they function with their wives. Look and learn. Because, and so it's not just about we want to keep you because we want you in the church because you're going to serve. It's like this kind of environment will be, for me, I know I learned some deep things about parenting through watching families in the church. That's how I learned. I learned how to be with my girls a little bit. There was a little bit of what I learned through watching them. So, Gavin, do you have any other comments or?
Yeah, I mean, just really fascinating listening to both Tony and yourself. And I haven't got any particular questions, but just a train of thought, just around the issue of youth and how young people's understanding of the world, their lens is vastly different to ours. And whilst we've got this setting, we're discussing these issues, by virtue of us doing so, we're probably ahead of the curve on this issue, just by virtue of being in a room and being willing to talk about it, because there's a lot of churches that just aren't talking about this. But if you were to speak to young people in our churches, they may say something completely different in terms of our approach to developing leaders, addressing issues of diversity, touching on some of those cultural issues that affect them, because their connection to the world is very different. Their understanding of the world is very, very different, and that they feel passionate about stuff happening all over the place. And it feels like it's on their doorstep because of social media. And I just wondered how you manage that, or whether you've got any thoughts on that in terms of youth. And I just wanted to add to that just something that touches on what both yourself and Tony said about the cultural differences, in that we ran a consultation on race at Crown Church in October. And just one of the thoughts that came through is really interesting is that pertinent to young people, is that some of the white parents and the white kids, the youth setting was about having fun and letting your hair down in a safe space, whereas among some of the Black African and African Caribbean parents were like, should be about teaching and all of that. And I grew up with both. My parents are from the Caribbean, but I grew up in part in a kind of white, a predominantly white middle class church, and that kind of whole tension and that balance as well. Have you just got any rough thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, so this is where I would sort of encourage you to really think through the principal practical thing, because whilst young people's worldview is so very different, and I totally accept that, if what we are hitting are biblical principles, they're timeless and they are important for that generation. Let's not overplay the differences. They are important. You still want a young person to marry and understand what faithfulness and fidelity is. You want them to do that. And even though in their minds they might be far more fluid in the way they think, you want to bring them back to some kind of biblical understanding and some principles that they can then apply into their context. So you still want to do that. We don't want to overdo that. I think that difference between how, which might show starkly between young people in terms of we want to just have fun, we want it to be serious kind of thing. That is definitely a cultural one, and it is in part linked to wealth, and a wealthy, not just individuals' wealth, but a wealth of a nation, which means that you go to Thorpe Park, yeah, You know, I remember a friend of mine who came over from Africa. He married, actually married an Asian girl here. When he first went to Alton Towers, it made no sense to him. Just made no sense to him. This idea of just going out for leisure, fun, that was not life, kind of thing. And I remember when I went out to Kenya, and they showed us, you know, the views of the Rift Valley. To the Kenyans, it meant nothing. But to the people coming from the West, it was like, wow. So when you live close hand to mouth, it's very different. When you think education is your way out, it's very different. But I think both of those things, I think there can be a synergy in those things, and that we don't need to culturalize them. We don't need to racialize them, because you do want kids to work hard, learn well, and have fun. You do want that. And so you do want kids who naturally lean towards having fun to take things seriously. We need to take God seriously. You know, the grace of God teaches us to say no to ungodliness. The grace of God is not there to teach you to do what you like. It teaches you something. But you also want, on the other hand, people who come from a place of working hard and to recognize, oh my goodness, that we can also do fun as well. So I think that is a challenge, I suppose, for the church. I mean, I would say some of these thoughts probably come out from my experience at New Day, in terms of really wanting to help young people understand the principle of things, even though it applies differently practically for them, but not moving away from it, not thinking that suddenly they're going to have it all, because they won't get it if you don't bring that to them. They won't have that understanding. Does that make sense? I hope that kind of helps.
It's really helpful. Yeah, it really makes sense. It's something that has, for me, become increasingly apparent just as I'm involving myself a bit more with the youth and the young people. There's just kind of an unspoken divide. And the youth are even more diverse. I mean, we're about 60% non-white at Crown. In the youth, it's even more than that, and right. which is great. And but there's just those differences that are there, and the kids themselves aren't picking up on it. It's the parents that are, you know, why aren't we doing more teaching, or why aren't we having more fun? Because our kids need to let their hair down after a difficult week. And you know, we're balancing both. I think we're doing an okay job. Yeah. You know, you get it wrong, you get it right. You know, a mixture of both. But
I just think bring vision to it, so that both see the benefits. So that is you guys bringing vision to it and recognizing that, oh, for us to truly build a multicultural church, it's going to look different to this, and it's going to look different to that. And so I think that it's, but that's great if you're, you know, the fact that you're.
It's gone 11, and I'm just so grateful for both of you, particularly you, Owen, and just to we could listen to you forever. You just sort of ooze wisdom on these sort of things, and it's always, you ask a question and pow, suddenly there's nuggets that are coming out that you're inspiring. So I really do appreciate your time, and I'm sure that not just us, but others who are aware and sort of circulate this conversation will benefit from it. So really appreciate your time and your wisdom and your friendship.